The ghost in the shell, Hitler's secret graveyard. It was the winter of 1944, and by all accounts the Third Reich was dying. On the frozen plains of the east, the Soviet juggernaut was grinding its way relentlessly toward Berlin. In the skies over Germany, Allied bombers flew with near impunity, turning ancient cities into seas of fire and rubble. The German war machine, once the terror of Europe, was starved of fuel, men and hope. A dangerous sense of optimism had settled over the Allied command, a belief that the war was all but won, that one final push would bring the conflict to its inevitable conclusion by Christmas. They were dangerously, catastrophically wrong. In the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, a region considered so quiet and impassable that it was known as the Ghost Front, Adolf Hitler was secretly gathering the last of his formidable strength for one final, desperate roll of the dice. He had assembled a force that defied all Allied intelligence estimates. Over 200,000 men, many of them fanatical veterans of the Eastern Front, 1,000 of his most feared Tiger and Panther tanks, and the elite of the Waffen-SS, the very tip of his ideological spear. This was a force of terrifying power, poised to launch a surprise attack so swift and so devastating that it would shatter the Allied lines, split their armies in two, and fundamentally change the course of the war. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, and it was to be his masterpiece of destruction, a thunderclap of German fury that would bring his enemies to their knees. But this colossal gamble, born from the mind of a cornered madman, would not be decided by the steel of Panther tanks, nor by the sheer weight of numbers, nor even by the raw courage of soldiers fighting and dying in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Instead, the fate of Hitler's last great offensive, and indeed the fate of the war in the West, would be sealed by a secret. A secret so closely guarded, so revolutionary, that its security classification rivaled that of the atomic bomb. It was a ghost in the machine, a tiny, almost magical brain hidden inside an ordinary artillery shell, a device no larger than a coffee can. This small, unassuming piece of technology would transform the very air above the battlefield into a weapon, rendering every foxhole, every forest, and every shred of cover utterly useless. It would become the invisible enemy that German soldiers swore had eyes, the technological phantom that turned Hitler's last hope into the graveyard of his most elite forces. How did one small piece of technology, an unthinking bundle of wires and tubes, become the most decisive weapon of the European war and rewrite the brutal mathematics of combat forever? The Watch on the Rhine, a perfect, deceptive storm. The final months of 1944 were a time of perilous overconfidence for the Allied forces in Europe. After the spectacular breakout from the Normandy beachheads and the triumphant liberation of Paris, a sense of inevitable victory had permeated every level of command. The German Wehrmacht appeared to be in a state of terminal collapse, reeling back toward its own borders in what seemed like a disorganized rout. The Allied supply lines, stretched to their breaking point by the famous Red Ball Express, were struggling to keep up with the rapid advance. This logistical strain, combined with the onset of the worst winter in decades, forced a temporary halt to the main Allied thrust toward Germany. The Ardennes forest, a rugged, densely wooded region of hills and valleys straddling the border of Belgium and Germany, was consequently downgraded in strategic importance. It was considered a quiet sector, a ghost front. This was the perfect place to season new, untested American divisions, like the 99th Checkerboard Division, whose young soldiers had yet to hear a shot fired in anger. It was also a designated rest and recuperation area for battle-hardened but exhausted units like the 28th Keystone Division, which had just been chewed to pieces in the bloody, meat-grinding horror of the Hurtgen Forest. Allied intelligence reports, compiled by officers comfortable in their rear echelon headquarters, were unanimous and dismissive. The Germans lacked the fuel, the men, and the morale to launch any significant offensive action. It was a comfortable belief, and it was a catastrophic miscalculation. Hidden beneath the thick, snow-laden canopy of the Ardennes, shielded from the prying eyes of Allied reconnaissance planes by persistent, impenetrable winter fog, Adolf Hitler was orchestrating his final masterpiece of mayhem. He believed the alliance between the British and the Americans was a fragile, unnatural partnership, born of convenience, one that could be shattered by a single decisive blow. His plan, Wacht am Rhein was breathtaking in its audacity and simplicity. He would hurl 3 full armies through the weakest point in the American line, a sector held by only 4 understrength divisions. This armoured spearhead, led by the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, would then drive a wedge between the British forces in the north and the American forces in the south, cross the Meuse River, and then wheel north to seize the vital port of Antwerp. This single stroke would not only sever the main Allied supply artery, but would also trap nearly 1 million Allied soldiers in a massive pocket, creating a disaster on the scale of Dunkirk. He promised his skeptical generals that this would force the Western Allies to sue for a negotiated peace, allowing him to turn his full military might back against the relentless Soviet advance on the Eastern Front. The sheer scale of the German buildup was a logistical feat of deception accomplished in absolute secrecy. Over 200,000 soldiers were moved into their final assault positions, often at night and under conditions of strict radio silence. To conserve precious fuel, many units relied on horse-drawn carts for transport, a primitive sight that belied the modern armoured power they concealed. Nearly 2,000 artillery pieces were painstakingly hidden in dense forests, their positions camouflaged with branches and snow. Most terrifying of all were the 1,000 tanks, including the formidable 66-ton Tiger II and the agile Panther tanks, which had been painstakingly conserved and refueled for this one all-or-nothing operation. On the morning of December 16th, at 5:30 a.m., the German guns opened fire. An earth-shattering barrage thundered across an 85-mile front as 1,600 rounds a minute fell on the unsuspecting American positions. For the GIs huddled in their freezing foxholes, many of whom had been dreaming of a quiet Christmas, it was as if the world was ending. Communications were severed instantly. Entire platoons and companies seemed to simply vanish under the sudden, violent onslaught. Through the pre-dawn gloom, the silhouettes of German tanks and infantry surged forward, punching huge holes in the thinly held American lines. The surprise was total. The initial breakthrough was a stunning success. But as this German tide of steel and desperation surged forward, it was about to crash against a secret wall of science that no one, not even most American generals, knew existed. The impossible problem, building a brain for a bullet. Long before the first shots of the Battle of the Bulge echoed through the Ardennes, a different, quieter kind of war was being waged in secret laboratories half a world away. The problem they were trying to solve was as old as artillery itself. A cannonball or an explosive shell is only truly effective if it detonates at the exact right moment in the exact right place. For centuries, this had been the Achilles heel of artillery. A shell that strikes the ground before exploding wastes the vast majority of its destructive energy simply digging a useless crater in the dirt. Its fragments either fly harmlessly upwards or are absorbed by the soft earth. To be truly lethal against infantry in the open, a shell needed to explode in the air above its target, showering a deadly cone of shrapnel downwards. Gunners had long relied on timed fuses to achieve this, a kind of primitive clockwork or powder train mechanism that was supposed to detonate the shell after a set number of seconds. But these were notoriously unreliable, a frustrating guessing game dependent on precise calculations of range, trajectory, wind speed, and barometric pressure. A tiny error in calculation, a slight variation in the burn rate of the powder, and the shell would either explode harmlessly hundreds of feet in the air or bury itself in the mud. What was needed was a shell that could think for itself, a shell equipped with its own senses, one that could perceive its target and know exactly when to explode to cause the most possible carnage. In the early 1940s, this concept seemed to belong firmly in the realm of science fiction, an idea from the pages of a Buck Rogers comic strip. The task of wrestling this impossible idea into reality fell to a brilliant and relentlessly determined physicist named Dr. Merle Tuve. Working out of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Tuve and his team were engaged in a desperate race against time. To maintain absolute secrecy, the entire project, codenamed Section T, was housed in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, cunningly disguised as a used car dealership. Inside this mundane-looking building, some of America's brightest scientific minds confronted a series of technical challenges that seemed, at first, to be insurmountable. Their goal was to build a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, in essence a complete Doppler radar set, and then to cram this delicate and complex piece of electronics into the cramped, hostile space of an artillery shell's nose cone. This tiny device then had to survive the most violent and hostile environment that human engineering had ever conceived. The moment it was fired from a cannon, the shell and everything inside it would be subjected to the unimaginable violence of 20,000 times the force of gravity, an instantaneous acceleration that would crush any ordinary electronics into a fine powder. It would have to endure searing temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit inside the gun barrel, only to be plunged into the sub-zero cold of the upper atmosphere moments later. And all the while, it would be spinning at a dizzying 25,000 revolutions per minute, a centrifugal force so powerful it would tear its delicate components from their mountings and smash them against the shell's casing. It was, as one scientist put it, like trying to build a wristwatch that could survive being shot out of a cannon and still keep perfect time. To overcome these brutal realities, Tuve's team had to systematically rewrite the known rules of electronics. They took the fragile glass vacuum tubes found in household radios and, through thousands of hours of painstaking trial and error, redesigned them to be no larger than a pencil eraser, encasing their delicate filaments in special, shock-absorbing wax and ceramic. They invented a battery that was completely inert and safe to handle until the very moment of firing. Inside each fuse was a small glass ampule filled with electrolyte fluid. The colossal shock of the shell's launch would instantly shatter this ampule, flooding a stack of tiny metal plates and creating a power source. It was a kamikaze battery, one that only came to life at the exact moment it was needed, and then only for the 50 seconds or so of the shell's flight time. Once activated, the miniature radar would begin emitting a continuous stream of radio waves. As the shell arched through the sky on its ballistic trajectory, these waves would bounce off the ground, trees, or buildings below. The receiver would listen for the reflected signal, and as the shell got closer to the ground, the returning signal would grow stronger. When that signal reached a specific, preset strength, the fuse knew it had reached the perfect altitude for maximum lethality, typically between 30 and 50 feet. It would then trigger the main explosive charge, showering a perfect cone of red-hot steel fragments down onto everything and everyone below. They gave it the deliberately boring, bureaucratic name of the VT fuse, for variable time, a masterful piece of misdirection to conceal its true, revolutionary nature. Solving this scientific puzzle in a laboratory was a monumental achievement, but turning it into an industrial-scale miracle of mass production was a challenge on the scale of the atomic bomb itself. The secret factory floor, America's hidden army. The creation of the proximity fuse wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was an industrial epic, a secret war waged on factory floors across America. While the world's attention was focused on the more famous Manhattan Project, which was secretly building the atomic bomb in the isolated deserts of New Mexico, an equally vast, complex and clandestine enterprise was underway to mass-produce this ghost in the shell. The project was deemed so critical to the war effort that it was given a priority rating higher than any other weapon program, second only to the atomic bomb. Over 100 different American companies, a true cross-section of the nation's industrial might, were enlisted in the effort. Giants of industry like RCA, General Electric and Sylvania turned over entire factories, retooling their assembly lines to produce the fuse's complex electronic components. The Crosley Corporation, famous for its affordable cars and iconic kitchen refrigerators, abruptly stopped making consumer goods and began churning out the tiny, ruggedized vacuum tubes that formed the fuse's brain. The cost of this monumental effort was astronomical, ballooning to over $1 billion wartime dollars, a sum that, in the 1940s, was almost beyond comprehension. The workforce behind this industrial miracle was a hidden army of its own. Thousands upon thousands of American civilians, the vast majority of them young women who had entered the workforce for the first time as part of the Rosie the Riveter generation, took on the monumental task. They worked grueling 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, hunched over brightly lit assembly lines. Their task was one of microscopic precision, soldering the 130 tiny, delicate components that made up the internal workings of each fuse. The quality control measures were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Every single solder joint, no bigger than the head of a pin, was meticulously inspected under a microscope. Every component was rigorously tested for durability and performance. Sample fuses were regularly pulled from each production batch and transported to proving grounds, where they were fired from cannons and tracked by radar to ensure they performed flawlessly. Each fuse was stamped with a serial number, allowing the Army to trace any failure back to the specific factory, the specific assembly line, and even the specific worker who had built it. No error was tolerated. The secrecy surrounding the project was absolute. Signs on the factory walls constantly reminded workers, "Loose lips sink ships." They were never told what they were building, only that it was a top national priority, a secret weapon that would help end the war and bring their husbands, brothers, and fathers home safely. The supreme irony was that German scientists had been on the verge of the very same breakthrough years earlier. As early as 1940, brilliant engineers at major German firms like Rheinmetall-Borsig had developed working prototypes of a similar proximity fuse. But Hitler, pathologically obsessed with his concept of a blitzkrieg, or lightning war, had issued a short-sighted decree in 1941, cancelling any and all weapons projects that would take more than 6 months to complete. He wanted immediate results for the campaigns he was planning, not long-term speculative innovation. The German High Command, confident in the superiority of their existing technology, readily complied and shelved the fuse program. Their own scientists officially declared the concept too complex, too fragile, and ultimately too unrealistic to ever be reliably mass-produced. It was one of the most fatal technological and strategic blunders of the entire war. While Germany slept on its own innovation, American industry was secretly producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. The weapon was ready, stockpiled by the thousands in European ammunition depots, but it came with a strict, inviolable rule, an order handed down from the highest levels of the Allied command. For fear of the secret being discovered, the fuse was absolutely forbidden for use over land, where a dud could be recovered by the enemy, its secrets reverse-engineered, and the Allies' greatest technological advantage lost forever. But on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, rules, like front lines, were about to be broken. One man's gamble, the order that changed the war. On the frozen, chaotic morning of December 16, 1944, Colonel Oskar Alfred Axelson, the commander of the 406th Artillery Group, was facing an unfolding nightmare. His sector, centered around the quiet town of Monschau on the northern shoulder of the German attack, was being hammered into oblivion. The initial German artillery barrage had been overwhelming, and now the hardened veterans of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division were pouring through the shattered American lines. His main defensive unit, the small and lightly armed 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was being systematically overrun. Desperate radio calls painted a grim picture of annihilation. Axelson's conventional artillery, with its imprecise, ground-bursting shells, was having little effect on the advancing German infantry, who were masterfully using the thick snow-covered forest for cover from the exploding shells. He knew, with a cold certainty, that if he followed his standing orders and relied only on standard ammunition, his line would collapse within hours, and the German breakthrough in his sector would be complete and unstoppable. But Colonel Axelson knew something that almost no one else on the front lines did. He knew about the top-secret VT fuses, designated POSIT in classified communications, that were sitting, unused and forbidden, in his ammunition dumps. He had read the classified reports. He knew of their theoretical, unbelievable power. In that frozen, desperate moment, with the roar of battle echoing around him and the fate of his men hanging by a thread, he made a decision that would not only alter the course of the battle and the war, but would also put his entire military career on the line. He turned to his executive officer and gave a simple, history-altering command: load the new shells. The gunners in his batteries hesitated just for a breath. They too knew the risks. They had been briefed on the absolute secrecy of the POSIT rounds. If a single one of these secret fuses was captured intact by the enemy, the Germans could learn its secrets, and the Allies' greatest technological advantage would be lost. If the fuses failed to work as promised, or if his superiors discovered his blatant act of insubordination, Colonel Axelson would undoubtedly face a court-martial. But the line was breaking, and men were dying. The order stood. The heavy 155 steel shells, tipped with the innocuous-looking but revolutionary fuses, were rammed into the hot breeches of the howitzers. The lanyards were pulled, and the guns roared, sending their secret cargo screaming into the winter sky. What happened next was unlike anything the battle-hardened German soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division had ever witnessed in their brutal careers. Advancing in tight, confident formations through the snow, they heard the familiar, high-pitched whistle of incoming artillery. They instinctively dropped to the ground, seeking the safety of the frozen earth, just as their training had always dictated. But the familiar, ground-shaking thump of an explosion never came. Instead, the shells detonated high above the treetops, 30 to 50 feet in the air, with a series of blinding, terrifying flashes of light. In an instant, a lethal rain of thousands of red-hot steel fragments sliced down from above, shredding everything below, branches, earth, and human flesh, with a merciless geometric precision. The foxholes they had dug for protection offered none. They instantly became death traps, concentrating the deadly fragments on their occupants. The thick pine trees they used for cover were turned into secondary weapons, as the powerful explosions splintered them into a storm of deadly wooden shards that flew in all directions. Entire squads of veteran soldiers vanished in a matter of seconds. The advance, moments before so confident, dissolved into chaos. Confusion turned to panic, and panic turned to sheer terror. The attack faltered, then stalled completely, shredded to pieces by an unseen, inexplicable force. Survivors who were captured later spoke of some new, terrifying form of American sorcery, of shells that seemed to possess eyes and could hunt them down no matter where they were hiding. That single, unauthorized command had uncaged a monster, and now its reign of terror across the Ardennes was just beginning. The crucibles of fire, Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge. Colonel Axelson's unauthorized gamble at Monschau was the first crack that appeared in the seemingly unstoppable German offensive, but soon the devastating power of the proximity fuse would be unleashed in every critical sector across the entire Ardennes front. By Christmas, with the crisis reaching its peak, word of the new weapon's incredible effectiveness had raced up the chain of command. Faced with the potential for a catastrophic defeat, General Eisenhower himself made the decision to cast aside the initial secrecy and authorized the full, unrestricted deployment of the fuse. Nowhere was its impact more legendary than at the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne. There, the American 101st Airborne Division found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from all support, and vastly outnumbered by German forces who were under direct orders to capture the vital road hub at any cost. The weather was abysmal, with thick fog and low clouds grounding all Allied air support. Supplies of food, medicine, and ammunition were dwindling to critical levels. When the German commander sent a formal request for their surrender, the American acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave his now famous, defiant, and quintessentially American one-word reply: nuts. It was a magnificent display of bravado, but bravery alone could not hold back the relentless tide of German armor and infantry. Their true salvation came not from the sky, but delivered by the roaring muzzles of their own artillery. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, along with the often overlooked but heroic African-American gunners of the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, had been supplied with a precious few thousand rounds of the new proximity-fused shells. These guns became the 101st's unbreakable shield of steel. When the Germans launched wave after wave of determined infantry assaults across the open, snow-covered fields surrounding Bastogne, the American guns answered with a new kind of thunder. The proximity shells exploded with perfect, terrifying timing over the heads of the advancing German formations, scything through entire companies before they could even get close to the American defensive perimeter. The pristine, snow-covered fields, moments before alive with marching troops, became silent, featureless landscapes of the dead. The relentless, horrifyingly accurate fire created a perfect ring of death around Bastogne that no German soldier could penetrate. The siege held, thanks in large part to the invisible intelligence packed into the nose of an artillery shell. Even further north, at a critical defensive position on the main German axis of advance known as Elsenborn Ridge, the effect of the fuse was even more apocalyptic. Here, the Germans threw the absolute best they had into the fight. The elite 6th SS Panzer Army, including the infamous Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division. These were the most fanatical, ideologically driven and battle-hardened troops in the entire German military, and they were under direct orders to take the high ground of the ridge at any cost. For 3 brutal days they stormed the steep, forested slopes, only to be met by a continuous rolling storm of American artillery fire. Over 160,000 shells rained down on them in that 72-hour period. Only a quarter of those shells, about 40,000, were equipped with the new proximity fuses. Yet, post-battle analysis would reveal a staggering and horrifying truth. Those 40,000 shells were responsible for more than 60% of all German casualties on the ridge. Veterans of the fighting later described how entire SS companies, the supposed martial elite of the Reich, would simply disappear in a series of blinding flashes in the trees above them. The survivors of one blast would have to climb over the mangled piles of their own dead comrades, only to be cut down themselves by the next wave of inescapable airbursts. The SS, men who had been indoctrinated to believe in their own racial and martial invincibility, broke against an invisible fire raining down from the sky. The German army was being bled white on the ground, but Hitler, still desperate, had one last card to play in the sky, completely unaware that the Allies' most secret weapon was about to meet the very purpose for which it was originally designed. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's funeral pyre. By the end of December, Hitler's grand offensive was stalling everywhere. The stubborn American resistance, combined with crippling fuel shortages and the devastating effectiveness of the proximity fuse, had robbed the attack of its initial momentum. In a final desperate bid to regain the initiative, Hitler decided to play his last trump card, a massive, coordinated air assault aimed at crippling Allied air power on the ground. The plan was codenamed Operation Bodenplatte, or Baseplate. At dawn on New Year's Day 1945, nearly 900 German fighters and fighter bombers of the Luftwaffe roared into the sky, streaking at treetop level towards Allied airfields across Belgium and Holland in a stunning surprise attack. The initial strike was a tactical success. The surprise was total. Hundreds of Allied aircraft were caught on the ground and destroyed where they sat, burning in their parking revetments. For a few brief hours, it seemed as if the once mighty Luftwaffe had regained control of the air over the Ardennes. But as the jubilant German pilots turned for home, their great victory swiftly turned into a one-sided massacre. In the 2 weeks since the battle had begun, American anti-aircraft artillery batteries had been rushed to the front in huge numbers, and they came armed with the proximity fuse, the very weapon that had been originally and painstakingly designed for the sole purpose of shooting down aircraft. The German planes, flying back from their successful raids, flew into a sky that was now laced with thousands of invisible electronic tripwires. The American anti-aircraft gunners, manning their powerful 90 guns, no longer needed the near-impossible skill of scoring a direct hit on a fast-moving target. Their shells now only had to get close asterisk. As the Luftwaffe formations flew overhead, the American shells would burst in the air around them with uncanny, intelligent timing, filling the sky with lethal, expanding clouds of high-velocity shrapnel. German pilots who had survived years of brutal dogfights on multiple fronts were suddenly seeing their wings shredded and their engines destroyed by explosions that seemed to come from nowhere. A plane would be flying straight and level one moment, and the next, it would simply disintegrate in mid-air without warning. Of the 277 German aircraft confirmed lost that day, an astonishing 172 were brought down not by Allied fighters, but by anti-aircraft fire from the ground. The Luftwaffe, already bleeding experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft, was effectively shattered in a single morning. Operation Bodenplatte was not a triumph, it was the Luftwaffe's funeral pyre. It was the last great air assault of the Third Reich, and it ended in absolute ruin, thanks to a weapon the Germans themselves had once declared an impossible fantasy. The guns eventually fell silent, but the psychological impact of the funny fuse was only just beginning to be understood, not just on the scarred battlefields, but deep within the terrified minds of the men who had somehow survived it. The psychological toll, shells with eyes. When the snows of the Ardennes finally began to melt in the spring of 1945, they revealed the true cost of Hitler's last gamble. The once pristine forests were a mangled graveyard of shattered tanks, burned-out vehicles, and the ghosts of broken armies. The German offensive had cost them over 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, along with nearly all of their remaining armored reserves, resources they could never hope to replace. The Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophic military defeat for Germany, but hidden within those staggering numbers was a deeper, more profound story. The story of a complete psychological collapse brought on by a weapon that seemed to defy all the known laws of war. In prisoner of war camps across Belgium and France, American intelligence officers began to hear the same strange, terrifying stories again and again. German soldiers, from hardened, cynical veterans of the SS to fresh-faced teenage conscripts of the Volksgrenadier, spoke with a mixture of terror and bewildered awe about the American artillery. They called it magic, they called it sorcery, but most commonly they referred to it with a chillingly descriptive phrase. They called them shells with eyes. They described how these American shells seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, how they appeared to hunt them down, to find them no matter where they hid. A captured German lieutenant, a veteran of 4 years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, told his interrogators that nothing he had faced in the endless carnage of Russia had prepared him for the Ardennes. In Russia, he explained, you could always survive by digging. If you dug your foxhole deep enough, you were safe from almost anything. In the Ardennes, he said with a shudder, your foxhole simply became your grave. The thick forests that were supposed to provide excellent cover from air and artillery observation instead became death traps, as the powerful airbursts turned the trees themselves into a secondary wave of deadly, splintered projectiles. All the old rules of combat, all the hard-won instincts that kept a soldier alive on the battlefield, were suddenly and completely rendered obsolete. Clustering together for mutual support meant certain annihilation in a single devastating salvo. Spreading your men out left them isolated and exposed to the shell's wide, lethal blast radius. There was no tactic, no amount of training, no degree of raw courage that could effectively counter a weapon that killed you from the one direction you couldn't defend against, directly above. The psychological toll this inflicted was immense and immediate. Entire units broke and ran before even reaching the American lines, demoralized by the sight of the platoons ahead of them simply vanishing in a series of silent, deadly flashes in the sky. Some soldiers, gripped by a primal fear, simply refused orders to advance into open fields where they had seen their comrades vaporized by this invisible death from above. The German High Command, initially dismissive of the battlefield reports, was eventually just as stunned. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of the offensive, admitted plainly after the war, the proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down time and time again. It was not because of American courage alone, but because of your artillery that seemed to have eyes. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the brilliant commander of the 5th Panzer Army, confessed that the new shells caused unprecedented panic even among his most seasoned and decorated troops. For the first time in the war, the average German soldier feared not the man in the trench in front of him, but the invisible intelligence packed inside a shell miles away. The cold, hard statistics confirmed their deepest fears. The proximity fuse, which made up only about a quarter of the artillery shells fired during the battle, was directly responsible for over 60% of all German casualties from artillery. Its lethality was estimated to be 5 to 10 times greater than conventional ground-burst ammunition. The Battle of the Bulge was over. But the technological revolution it had started had only just begun. The proximity fuse didn't just win a battle, it had created the bloody blueprint for all future warfare. The echo of the fuse, a new age of warfare. The echoes of the guns in the Ardennes carried far beyond the shattered forests and scarred battlefields. The proximity fuse had proven itself to be not just another new weapon, but a genuine revolution in the history of warfare. General George S. Patton, a commander never known for subtlety or for praising technology over fighting spirit, was unequivocal in his assessment. "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us," he declared. He wrote vividly in his memoirs of witnessing a German battalion attempting a night crossing of the Sauer River, only to be completely and utterly erased in a matter of minutes by a single, devastating barrage of air-bursting shells, leaving 702 bodies to be counted in the morning light. It was a chillingly efficient demonstration of this new, technologically driven and almost impersonal form of destruction. The fuse's impact was so profound that it led to one of the great terrifying what-ifs of the Second World War. After Germany's surrender, the Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower himself admitted that had Germany possessed the proximity fuse on D-Day, the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy might very well have failed. A handful of well-placed German artillery batteries firing these shells could have turned the landing beaches into impassable killing fields, shredding the waves of Allied infantry before they even reached the shore. Victory in Europe could have been delayed by years, or perhaps lost entirely. That was the true measure of this invention. The legacy of the funny fuse extended far beyond the battlefield, becoming a catalyst for the post-war technological boom. The massive industrial and scientific effort that created it became the foundation for the modern electronics industry. The techniques of miniaturization, ruggedization, and microscopic quality control pioneered for the fuse program laid the essential groundwork for the development of the transistor and the integrated circuit. The tiny, robust vacuum tubes that once guided shells toward their targets would, in a few short years, evolve into the core components that powered the first computers and satellites. One of the key scientists who perfected the fuse's design, a young physicist named Dr. James Van Allen, would later use the exact same principles of ruggedized electronics to build the instruments for America's first satellites, leading to his Nobel Prize-winning discovery of the Earth's radiation belts, now known as the Van Allen belts. The very philosophy behind the fuse, a small disposable machine making an intelligent, autonomous decision at the moment of impact, was the direct technological ancestor of every guided missile, every cruise missile, and every smart bomb that defines the modern battlefield. In America, the thousands of factory workers, the women who had soldered the fragile circuits day after day in complete secrecy, were finally told what they had been building. They learned that their meticulous, secret work had saved the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers and had been a decisive factor in winning the war. In Germany, the survivors of the Ardennes carried with them for the rest of their lives the haunting memory of a merciless, invisible enemy. They had died in forests where the trees themselves became weapons, in rivers where the very air betrayed them, and in open fields where the sky rained down a storm of intelligent steel. Their deaths marked the brutal passage from an old way of war into a terrifyingly new one. In the snow and the silence of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare was truly born. The proximity fuse was more than just steel and circuitry. It was the definitive proof that science could irrevocably tip the scales of history. It was the precise moment the battlefield ceased to be ruled by men alone and began to be ruled by machines that could think, however simply, for themselves. From that frozen winter forward, every soldier who has ever looked up at the sky has known, consciously or not, that the empty air itself could kill, and that the cold, brutal mathematics of death would never, ever be the same again.